If you are just joining us, a couple of hours ago, I started the show off by telling you that I consider myself one of the fortunate ones. I am in that 50 to 64-year-old range, and I was able to finally, after a little wait, get an appointment for my AstraZeneca shot, and it's in a couple of weeks. At the same time, I felt a little guilty because my almost 71-year-old husband is having to wait a few more days before he gets his Pfizer or Mrna. I want to talk about AstraZeneca because as much as I'm happy, I've had lots of texters say, what about this? What about that? And that's why I like to bring in Dr. Raywat Deonandan, epidemiologist, associate professor, faculty of health sciences, University of Ottawa. Dr. Deonandan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I have so many questions, but I've also got a lot of texters having questions too, and I always feel like I can almost throw anything at you, and you've got an answer. But over the weekend, we had more reports of some countries suspending the AstraZeneca because of blood clots. What are you here to tell my listeners who are a little nervous when they hear those kind of headlines?
Yeah, you have to understand, this is the most scrutinized vaccine in history, the family of vaccines, rather. And every therapeutic ever rolled out has adverse events associated with them that may or may not be causal. It's just that we hear about every last one with these ones because they make the news every time. Mm-hmm. So the way that governments respond is, as soon as they hear a report of something that might be associated, they pull the plug, they suspend distribution as they investigate. That doesn't mean they know that there's a causal relationship. They just want time to investigate. So what the reports are saying is that a handful of individuals had serious blood clots, deep vein thrombosis, that's temporally associated with the vaccine, meaning this happened around the same time they got the vaccines. Now, let's look at what that means. These vaccines are given largely to the elderly, first of all, before rolling out to everybody else. So what else happens to the elderly? The elderly have all kinds of things going on with them, all kinds of negative adverse events. So we shouldn't be surprised when older people have things like blood clots and other bad things happen. It doesn't mean it's because of the vaccine. It might be coincidental because correlation is not causation. Mm-hmm. So they're investigating. And one way they investigate is they look at what the expected rate of deep vein thrombosis is and see if that coincides with the rate observed amongst the vaccinated. So we have about 5 million people in Denmark or that area that received the vaccine, 30 cases of deep vein thrombosis. That works out to 0.0006% of vaccinated people have this reaction. It's probably much less than that because the denominator is actually quite larger. Let's go with that number. And the expected rate of deep vein thrombosis in the general public is like 0.02% or 0.07%, depending on who you ask. It's 2 orders of magnitude more. In other words, the vaccinated population has fewer clots than everybody else. And here's the thing. If you are concerned about clots, as you shouldn't in this case, then you shouldn't be flying airplanes for that matter, or any other activity that causes these issues. So the risk is vanishingly small. Keep in mind that in India, tens of millions of people have received this vaccine with no issues associated with it. And in Canada, we don't get the European version, we get the Indian version. So we are so distant from that possibility of anything bad happening that it's vanishingly small. Having said that, nothing is without risk.
Yeah.
Right? So something injected into your body always has some risk associated with it. It's just that the risk is vanishingly small, and the benefit is potentially being immune from a possibly lethal disease. So the benefits far outweigh the small risk.
I said off the top, I fell into that 50 to 64-year-old category for AstraZeneca, and I'm happy to take it. But at the same time, I'm feeling a little guilty. It's unfortunate. Well, I say it's unfortunate that NACI, the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations, I don't want to say muddied the waters, but suddenly we're saying 65 and older shouldn't have AstraZeneca. And then we saw province after province follow that recommendation, even though Health Canada had said it was fine. Is that concerning when you start to get different messages out there?
It's a mess. It shouldn't be the way that it is. It's just that different groups are tasked with different responsibilities. Health Canada is tasked with okaying the vaccine. NACI is tasked with recommending how we use it. The provinces are tasked with deciding how we use it. And that's the nature of our heterogeneous, mixed administrative bureaucracy. here are the facts. The facts are that the randomized trial from which we get most of our guidance around these vaccines didn't enroll enough older people for the AstraZeneca trials. So we have some, but not many. As a result, some statisticians don't feel confident in computing an efficacy score for older people. They're not saying it doesn't work. They're just saying they can't compute the score. On the other hand, we have real-life data coming out of Scotland and England showing it works really well for the elderly. In fact, those over 80 have an 80% probability of not getting serious COVID if they take AstraZeneca. So that's why some problems have said that the real-life data is better than the clinical trial data, which I tend to agree with, frankly. So that's why this is a messed up, muddled affair.
Another messed up, muddled affair I felt was Pfizer and Moderna talking about the time in between first and second doses. And then I think it was NASA again that came out with the 4 months. And I that's what concerns me when you start to get the different messages.
Yeah, that too. Here's the background on that. We only know what was in the clinical trial. And the clinical trial formulation is based on what they investigated with previous clinical trials. They said 21 to 28 days later. So we know in some people in the clinical trial, a handful of people didn't get their second dose until later for a number of reasons. Either they forgot or they're late to get there or the doctor recommended they wait. For that handful of people, like 1% or so, they waited up to 42 days. And their efficacy scores were exactly the same as everybody who got on schedule. So that's the first signal that maybe you can wait 42 days. Then we looked at natural infection and found that people who got infected naturally, their antibodies stuck around for at least 90 days. So I thought, well, maybe we could wait 90 days. The 4-month thing, that's a little more questionable. But the reason I support the 4-month finding is that even though I don't think it's evidence-based, it's the best strategy to avoid a third wave, or at least the worst aspects of a third wave, by getting one shot into as many people as possible. You may not need to wait 4 months if we get sufficient supply. Right? So this is an emergency contingent in the wake of insufficient supply. And it may not even come to that. But there is some new data suggesting that maybe the elderly, we should maintain the shortened time period in between the doses. So I wouldn't be surprised if we don't do the full 4 months for everybody, just for the younger and the strong people.
Some people are saying, what if I got the AstraZeneca and then within that 4-month window, it wasn't available? Would I be fine with Moderna or Pfizer?
Okay. In theory, yes. But it hasn't been tested yet. So when I say in theory, it's because some virologists will claim that you actually get a better long-term response if you boost with something a bit different to give your body a bit of a challenge. And that is being tested in places like England, and we'll get some solid data at some point soon. But at this point, I doubt we'll have that recommendation in place because the unknowns are far too great. Worst thing that'll happen if you wait too long is you got to restart the regimen. You know? What we're risking here is two things by waiting a long time. You risk your immunity wanes, and maybe you go out into society and take some chances you shouldn't take, and you're not immune anymore. And we shouldn't be doing that anyway. If you've been vaccinated, that's not a passport to go and be social and be irresponsible. And the second risk is that is a theoretical one. That is, maybe by producing suboptimal immunity in the population, we create the circumstances for the arisal of what we call a vaccine escape variant. So a variant that maybe trains on these individuals with lower immune systems and develops a response to the vaccines. That's theoretical and unlikely, but that's the risk here. But the possible benefit, of course, is we get a dose into everybody and the disease goes away quickly.
And even on the variant then, because we're now hearing, I think we had our first case of the Brazil variant and we've had the UK variant in South Africa. So that's the question other people have had is just whether it be Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, will I be protected from the variants?
Yeah, good question. So we know that the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna, seem to work on most of the variants. We know this even though they were trialed at a time when the variants weren't circulating. What they have done since is taken blood from people who have been vaccinated and expose that blood to various variants and see if the blood produces antibodies. And it seems that they do. We know that AstraZeneca works really well against B.1.1.7, the UK variant, because it's circulating in the UK, and AstraZeneca works really well in the British population, so it's fine there. We know that the mRNA ones and Johnson & Johnson work well on B.1.351, the South African variant. because that was actually trialed in South Africa when that was prevalent. We know that we know that that AstraZeneca does not work very well on the South African variant. P1, the Brazilian one, is a little more uncertain. All that doesn't really matter. What we care about in Canada is really the UK variant, B117. Everything that we have in Canada, all the vaccines work great against B117, which is the most prevalent variant we have. And the plan is to just get those doses into many people to drive the case numbers down. And then later in the year, if we have to, we can deploy a booster via the mRNA vaccines for any new variant that might emerge. Remember, it takes 48 hours. That's it. 48 hours to create a new mRNA vaccine in response to a new virus. And just a few weeks to put that into production. So until we get that done, we need to use the existing vaccines to just get immunity into the population.
We know that here in Alberta, we've heard that this AstraZeneca suddenly became available to the 50 to 64-year-olds, as I said, because 65 and up weren't going to have it. And there was this concern with the shelf life. Am I right in understanding AstraZeneca has about a 30-day shelf life? I've had a few texters say they thought it was longer, a 6-month shelf life.
I don't know the answer to that. I know that the batch we received is about to expire in 1 month. The overall shelf life for a brand new batch is probably longer than that. I don't know exactly how long. Johnson & Johnson is about 3 months, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's on that scale.
Well, I'm glad I got you on one question. Someone was saying here, I'm 55, was diagnosed with breast cancer a couple of years ago. I finished chemosurgery, radiation by the end of March of 2019. I'm fine now, but one of my cancer meds did cause a heart condition. I was put on heart meds. Good news, my heart responded well enough that I was taken off the heart meds last fall. Now I'm on pins and needles. As to where I fall in the vaccine schedule, I can look up that one. But do I go by age or do I have an underlying condition? And I only wanted to share that one, Raywat, because every province has to figure out who gets it, when. And we've had a lot of organizations, whether it be police or teachers, saying we should be further up in the line. How difficult is it truly for health and policy decision makers to decide who gets what when?
It's really hard. It's really hard. And it comes down to the question that you're asking and the goal that we have here. Is the goal to make people immune? Is the goal to stop the disease? Is the goal to tough it out through the third wave? So everyone agrees that we have to do this by risk, but defining risk is difficult. I think of it in 3 categories. There are 3 kinds of risk. There's the risk of hospitalization and death, the risk of infection, and the risk of exposure. Who's at risk of exposure? Police and teachers and bus drivers. And, priests, anyone who's exposed to a lot of people. Who's at risk of infection? Healthcare workers, because they deal with the people most likely to be infected. Who's at risk of dying and hospitalization? The immunocompromised, the elderly, and, those with comorbidities. So the way I look at it is we should care about, first and foremost, preventing suffering, preventing death and morbidity. That means getting it into those at risk of hospitalization and dying. That means the elderly and the immunocompromised. Then we should care about not moving infection around. So that means getting into those likely to be infected, healthcare workers, and then go down from there. So there is something to be said, though, for doing this on a tiered basis by age. Start with the over 90s, over 80s, over 70s, and work your way down. That way you harden the population against probable death and morbidity.
Well, I think that's sort of the direction Alberta's been taking, although it was thrown a loop with the AZ AstraZeneca.
Yeah.
And I want to finish this off because I've taken more of your time than I should have. But will vaccinations be required every year like influenza vaccination?
Unlikely. Probably every couple of years. And even then, it won't be for the rest of our lives. Eventually, this thing will become endemic. We might even eliminate it. We won't eradicate it, but we will eliminate it, meaning it won't be within our borders. It may pop up now and then, in which case we can deploy a new booster here and there. But right now, the current thinking is that the current vaccines probably offer immunity for at least a year or two. So while it may not be something we see every season, it may be something we see every 2 or 3 seasons.
Raywat, thanks so much. I know there was lots of questions. I didn't get to all of them, but I'm glad you were able to tackle some of them with us.
Thank you.
Dr. Raywat Deonandan, he is an epidemiologist, associate professor, Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Ottawa.